If you're chronically blaming yourself after a breakup and think that everything is your fault, if your breakup stirred up old feelings of unworthiness and self-doubt, or if you're wondering if there's something fundamentally wrong with you now that you're broken up, then you may be suffering from the impact of toxic shame. In this video, we'll explore what toxic shame is and the origins of it, what it sounds like or feels like when it's happening to you, when you're experiencing it after a breakup, and what to do about it. Toxic shame isn't like healthy shame, the kind of shame that acts as a part of your moral compass, that kind of guides you and lets you know that maybe you weren't being so kind in a situation or that you could have handled things a little bit differently. Toxic shame, on the other hand, might take a similar situation where, let's say, you said or did the wrong thing, or maybe you didn't even say the wrong thing, but you think that you did, and you leave an innocuous conversation only to blow it out of proportion in your mind. You compulsively blame yourself, you ruminate on it for days or maybe even weeks, and you chastise yourself to no end. Toxic shame in this way is pervasive. It's a persistent feeling of shame, one that can not only be psychological, like the voice of a constant internal critic. It can also be physiological, like a heaviness in the body or the feeling of experiencing a kind of brain fog. Toxic shame can even be correlated with dissociation, so feeling like you're chronically spacing out or feeling like you're in your head but have no awareness of your body, even numbness or disconnection from your emotions, or at another extreme, being flooded with emotion. It can also lead to pervasive types of behaviors like self-isolation, rumination, or masking your vulnerabilities. Also, a deep fear of rejection or exposure can be coupled with toxic shame, and an inability to accept yourself. Often, this type of shame can even be ingrained into a person's perception of themselves. It shows up as a chronic sense of unworthiness or defectiveness or a deep feeling of inadequacy. And the particular flavors of negative self-talk are really very unique to the individual. And some of them can actually be very subtle. They may not be overt, like you may not constantly be telling yourself that you're unworthy. And typically people who suffer from toxic shame, when this is left untreated, they don't really recognize this kind of pervasiveness or this sneaky and kind of corrosive culprit. Now, why does toxic shame flare up after a breakup? And especially when your partner was a bit more emotionally distant. The first reason I think that's important to talk about is that a breakup can exacerbate someone who, the symptoms of someone who already experiences toxic shame, because it pushes on an attachment wound that's already there and that's unhealed. Toxic shame can illuminate often the disempowering beliefs that we hold about ourselves that we may not be in contact with on a daily basis. A lot of times relationships that emulate one aspect of our formative years or that feel familiar in one way or another, they don't have to be the same, but they can be familiar. They can really bring to the surface the unresolved shame patterns from that time. And this is where it can be really confusing, because a lot of times people don't understand why they're having such elevated symptoms around the breakup, and they don't realize that it's actually bringing up maybe memories or sensations or emotions from the past that are unhealed, and it's getting all kind of jumbled up together. One of the ways that we can combat toxic shame after a breakup is by bringing awareness to the shame-based conversations that we have with ourselves. So if you want to stop shaming yourself, you have to first identify what those conversations sound like in your head. So what we want to do is first identify these conversations so we can start to build some separation from them. So once you identify these dialogues, you're going to have more space and you're not going to be so embedded in them. Quickly, I want to talk about this concept of embeddedness. So this concept of embeddedness is taken from attachment theory. And basically, as children, we are embedded with our thoughts and our feelings and our perceptions before we learn to have any kind of separation from them. So if you've ever been around a child who is frantic, who is crying to no end, that child does not have any distance from what they're experiencing. They don't have any capacity to go, oh gosh, maybe I'm sad or maybe I'm distressed. They're completely immersed in their experience. And typically a caregiver can bring this compassionate mirroring for a child's experience. And that will support the child in creating tolerance for various emotions and cognitions. So as adults, we have the capacity to conjure up that compassionate mirroring for ourselves. So hence creating awareness around how we shame ourselves is the first step to begin to loosen up these toxic patterns. Now let's talk about some of the toxic shame patterns I've noticed and how they show up in people who are struggling to recover from a breakup. So toxic shame can sound like believing that you are too much. You're too emotional, you're too needy, your needs are overwhelming. Often I'll talk with people who blame the breakup on the fact that they were just too much. And that if they just asked for less, if they didn't overwhelm their partner with their needs, that things could have gone differently. And while, of course, there are tactful and appropriate ways to communicate our needs, and it's important to learn how we can be responsible for our behavior and communication, often the belief that we are too much is actually the culprit that gets in the way of owning our needs and clearly communicating them. In fact, I can't tell you how many times I've talked to people who actually did not really communicate their needs throughout the relationship. They hid their needs because of this fear of being too much. And then maybe their needs came out at the end, and then they use that as evidence to basically prove whatever they already think about themselves, that they're somehow too much. Another way that toxic shame shows up is when people pull away. So whether you were broken up with or your partner recently pulled away, the actual pulling away, that distance can bring on a shame attack for many people. In the space after a breakup, people have all of this room, all of this time to make up things about what's going on and what happened. And they do this in the absence of information. They start to fill in the gaps. So why don't we fill in the gaps with even-keeled, rational possibilities about why things ended and what to think now? Well, often the space after a breakup can be the actual trigger of shame, especially if we're on the anxious side of things. The space can feel like a vacuum for people with the abandonment wound. It can bring up unprocessed memories and feelings. And if we're not yet prepared to process those feelings, we can resort to feelings of shame. One sneaky way toxic shame can present itself after a breakup is it can be confused with other emotions. So a lot of times I hear people say things like, I'm tired of feeling sad, or I'm angry all of the time, I don't want to feel this way anymore. Or they may even have some kind of rule, some kind of cap in their mind for how long they're allowed to feel sad or, angry or uncomfortable for. And how this kind of correlates with toxic shame is that a lot of times what people are describing is not an actual emotion. They're not actually feeling their feelings. They're touching into their relationship with those emotions. So if we have trauma or if we have adverse childhood experiences around that get coupled with certain emotions, for instance, it was not appropriate for us to feel angry with our caregivers growing up, or we got punished for feeling sad, or we were told to, be strong and to stop crying. Like this type of messaging then can lead to us feeling shame around uncomfortable emotions, which are a natural part of grieving and of loss. When we go through a breakup, we experience a host of emotions that we don't feel on a day-to-day basis. Grief, disappointment, loss, sadness, anger, frustration, betrayal. These are not everyday emotions that humans typically feel, and all at once. So while it may seem that we are just feeling this emotion and we simply can't get out of it, what we're actually experiencing is usually shame around that emotion, and that emotion is actually not getting processed through. Because here's an interesting tidbit about processing emotions is usually once an emotion gets processed through, it actually happens pretty rapidly. Emotions are like waves. They're just kind of passing through. They're trying to send us a message and they're trying to move on so we can get to our baseline. And when we experience toxic shame coupled with those emotions, that's when those emotions become sticky and they stick around. Another way toxic shame can show up is by feeling like you weren't enough. So earlier I talked about being too much. Now this is the opposite of that. So in fact, when someone decides to leave the relationship, toxic shame can lead us to believe that it's our inherent deficiency that ultimately made our partner leave. Sometimes clients may even compare themselves unfavorably to their partner after a breakup and feel more and more inadequate. They can focus on perceived deficiencies such as physical appearance, accomplishments, or personality traits. And this reinforces the belief that they somehow fall short and are not enough for someone to love or desire them. Finally, a common way that we shame ourselves after a breakup is by going back and wishing that we could have done more or done things differently. And often people will pore over how things went and how they could have turned out differently if they could have done this one thing different. The problem with this is that unless you have a time machine, you can't actually go back to change the things that you said or did. And the reality is that hindsight is always 20/20. So of course you're able to look more lucidly at something that happened in the past and play out a do-over in your head when you're not triggered by that person in this moment, when the stakes are no longer high, and when you can objectively go over something multiple times from the safety and privacy of your own mind. The problem is that when we do this, we lose all sense of context. That our relationship, the things we said or did, never happened in a vacuum. Most of the time, ruptures happen way faster than we have control over. And we definitely don't have control over other people's reactions. And their reactions are not the sum of our behavior. So while you can beat yourself up for what you did or didn't do or what you didn't know at the time, I want you to notice that in the process of that, you're actually deleting a lot of pertinent information to what led you to make those decisions in the first place, and with the tools that you had at the time. Do you relate to any of these examples of toxic shame? Let me know in the comments below. One of the best ways to overcome toxic shame after a breakup is to build an inner dialogue that is self-compassionate. Compassion is the antidote to chronic shame. Now, a lot of times people don't know how to access a compassionate voice, and one of the pitfalls of the positive thinking movement is that it teaches people to reach for a self-dialogue that's like a positive self-dialogue that's so foreign from the depths of shame and distress we may be feeling when we go through a loss that is deeply and irrevocably impactful. So having self-compassion is less about positive thinking and it's more about rational thinking. When we're hyper-focused on how bad we are or that unforgivable thing that we did, rarely are we actually connected to the truth of the situation. Most relationships end because of a series of complex reasons and rarely because of one thing that one person did. I think it's important to broaden our view of the situation to both combat toxic shame and to be realistic about how much power we actually have when two people are involved in a relationship and how much responsibility that we are taking on that is often too much for a two-person relationship. If you found this video helpful and you'd like more ways to identify maybe some of your toxic shame patterns and learn how to enable the voice of compassion within, if you'd like to be able to have a more rational perspective about your relationship so that you can be both fair to yourself and fair to your partner and be able to put the relationship behind you in your life story, take the lessons that you want to take and leave behind the rest, then I highly recommend signing up for one-on-one coaching with me. You can book a one-on-one session with me to explore a working relationship to see if it's a fit. You can do so by clicking the link in the comments below or in the description. Did you like this video? If you did, give me a thumbs up and go ahead and subscribe to my channel if you want to watch more videos like this one. Next up is my video on, are you gaslighting yourself after a breakup? If you like this video and you want more mental health tools and support while you recover from your breakup, then I highly recommend that you check out that video. That's going to be right up here. All right, thanks so much for watching and I'll see you on the next one.